Mother threatened to erase me from her will unless I married the man she picked. Instead, I showed her that her money had never owned me, and that lesson cost us both almost everything before it saved us. My mother, Vivian Ashcroft, ran our family the way a general runs a campaign, with money as her only weapon and everyone else as soldiers who either obeyed or were left behind. She'd inherited a fortune from my grandfather, a man who built half the strip malls between Pasadena and Santa Barbara back when land in California was still cheap enough to gamble on. When he died, the money landed in Vivian's hands, and from that day forward, she used it the way some people use a loaded gun, not always firing, but always making sure you could see it sitting on the table. She chose where we lived based on which zip codes impressed the women she lunched with in Montecito. We moved 3 times before I turned 12, each house perched a little higher in the hills above the coast, each one selected less for how it felt to live in and more for how it sounded when she mentioned the address at a dinner party. She chose our schools by studying which families sent their children where, mapping out the social geography of Southern California like a chessboard. She chose our careers before we were old enough to spell them. Something prestigious, something that photographed well, something she could drop casually into conversation while everyone nodded and refilled their wine. Every decision I ever made had to pass through her first. And if it didn't, there was always the threat waiting underneath, quiet and cold. You'll get nothing when I'm gone. Growing up in those hills, I honestly didn't know this was strange. I assumed all mothers held inheritance over their children like a sword on a thread. I thought sentences like, "keep this up and you'll be cut off," were just the normal music of family life. I thought love and money were the same thing wearing 2 different faces. By the time I understood how wrong that was, I was already deep in the machine, spinning its gears, trying every single day to earn the approval of a woman who handed it out in teaspoons. I became a lawyer because Vivian wanted a lawyer in the family, someone to say, "My daughter, the attorney," at the club. I enrolled at a firm in downtown Los Angeles, took the cases she found respectable, wore the suits she approved of. I dated the men she selected because she paid my law school loans and reminded me gently that the payments could stop whenever she felt disrespected. I went to charity galas in Beverly Hills that I loathed. I smiled at people whose names I forgot on purpose. I performed the role of the perfect Ashcroft daughter so well that for years I forgot there was a real person underneath the costume. My younger brother figured out the game long before I did. Ethan was always the sharper one, the one who saw the strings and refused to dance. He rebelled at 17, walked out the door at 18 with a duffel bag and a bus ticket, and moved all the way to Portland just to put distance between himself and the money. Vivian cut him off completely, not just financially, but socially, emotionally, entirely. She told the whole family he was dead to her. She had her attorney amend the will in front of witnesses, then made sure every cousin and aunt knew that Ethan would inherit nothing but the memory of his own stubbornness. She used him as a cautionary tale for years. This is what happens to children who forget who feeds them. And I watched, and I learned, and I stayed quiet. Then, at 29, I met someone my mother had absolutely nothing to do with. His name was Cole Ramirez, and he was a carpenter. He built custom furniture, long dining tables from reclaimed California oak, cabinets that fit into old craftsman homes like they'd grown there, headboards commissioned by wealthy clients in the canyons who wanted something no store could sell them. He made a genuinely good living, doing work he loved with his own 2 hands, and he was the least impressed by money person I had ever met in my life. We met at a small coffee shop in Silver Lake on a Sunday morning. I was reading a worn paperback in the corner, and he leaned over, apologized for interrupting, and told me it was one of the best books he'd ever read. We talked for 2 hours. The coffee went cold. I gave him my number without once thinking about what my mother would say, which, looking back, was the first genuinely free thing I'd done in a decade. For the first 6 months, I kept Cole a secret. I told my mother I was too swamped with cases to date. I saw him on weekends and told her I was visiting friends up the coast. I fell completely in love while lying to everyone I was related to. It felt like living two lives, one gray and performing, one warm and real, and I dreaded the day the two would collide. Eventually, of course, Vivian found out. She always found out. She had friends stationed across Southern California like a network of watchtowers, women who reported back to her the way spies report to a queen. Someone spotted me at a seafood restaurant in Santa Monica with Cole, described him as some working-class guy in a flannel shirt. And the call came within the hour. My mother's voice on the phone was ice wrapped in silk. She demanded to know who he was, and for once, I didn't lie. I told her I'd been seeing someone for 6 months and that I was happy, happier than I'd been in years. She asked what he did. I told her he was a carpenter. There was a silence and then a single word. No. She said I would end it immediately or face consequences. She said she already had someone far better in mind, a young man named Preston Vance, the son of one of her wealthiest friends from the club. He worked in private equity, came from old California oil money, and looked exactly like the kind of son-in-law Vivian could brag about over Sunday brunch. She'd apparently been planning the match for years. She just hadn't bothered to tell me until my own choices threatened her design. I told her I wasn't interested in Preston. I told her I was in love with Cole. She said love was irrelevant, that financial security was the only thing that mattered in this world, and that a carpenter could never give me the life I deserved. Then she delivered the line I'd heard my whole life, only this time aimed directly at me. If I didn't end things with Cole and give Preston a real chance, she would remove me from her will entirely. The house in the hills, the investment accounts, the jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, all of it, gone. I would be as dead to her as Ethan was. I asked for time to think. She gave me 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, I did an enormous amount of thinking, just not about the thing she expected. I thought about Ethan, who'd been cut off for over a decade and had not only survived, but built a good, quiet, honest life for himself in Oregon. I thought about Cole, who built beautiful things out of raw wood and had never once, not a single time, asked about my family's money. I thought about the woman I had become. Anxious, performing, exhausted, forever auditioning for the affection of someone who only loved me on conditions. And I thought about the difference between what I actually wanted and what my mother had decided I should want. At the end of the 2 weeks, I called her. I told her I chose Cole. She said she was disappointed but not surprised. She said I was making the greatest mistake of my life. She said she'd have her attorney amend the will by Friday, and that I should remember this exact moment years from now when I was struggling to pay a mortgage while Preston's wife lived comfortably in the hills. Then she hung up. I expected to feel destroyed. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in my entire adult life, free. The threat she had held over my head since childhood had finally actually landed, and I was still standing. She had no power left over me because she'd fired her only weapon. You cannot threaten someone with a thing that's already happened, so I built a life that didn't depend on a single dollar of hers. I threw myself into work and got promoted twice in 3 years, made junior partner faster than anyone at the firm expected. Cole and I moved in together, and a year later bought a small sun-warmed bungalow in Eagle Rock with a lemon tree in the backyard and a garage he converted into a workshop. I reconnected with Ethan, flew up to Portland to see the life he'd made, a wife, a dog, a woodworking business of his own, ironically, and cried in his kitchen because I'd wasted so many years being afraid of the same man he'd stopped fearing at 18. I learned that Vivian's money would have come with strings attached forever, and that I was far better off earning my own. My mother didn't speak to me for 2 years. She told relatives I'd chosen a handyman over my own blood. She told her friends I'd thrown my future in the trash for someone beneath me. She cast herself as the tragic victim of an ungrateful daughter who couldn't appreciate sacrifice. And I let her tell whatever story she needed because I was finally living inside my own. Then her health began to fail. The phone rang at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I was already in bed reading, and Cole was at his desk in the corner of the bedroom, sketching designs for a client's staircase. I almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers that late are almost always spam, but something made me pick up. It was my Aunt Sandra, my mother's younger sister, her voice shaking and rushed. She said Vivian had collapsed in her bathroom earlier that evening. She said the paramedics had rushed her to Good Samaritan downtown. She said it was her heart and it looked bad. I grabbed a pen from the nightstand with a hand that wouldn't stay still and wrote the room number on the back of an old envelope while Sandra kept talking. Cardiac failure, emergency intervention, words that blurred together. Cole looked up the second he heard my voice change. He was on his feet and beside me before I even finished the call, one hand on my back. He said he'd drive me there right now if I wanted to go. I nodded because I couldn't make the words come out. We dressed in silence. Cole found my shoes, while I stood frozen, staring at the number I'd scrawled. The drive downtown took 25 minutes through empty freeways, the city lights smeared and cold through the windshield. Cole didn't ask if I was okay, because he already knew I wasn't. He just drove and kept one hand resting on my knee whenever he wasn't shifting gears. The hospital parking structure smelled like exhaust and antiseptic. We took the elevator to the cardiac floor, where the fluorescent lights made everything look too bright and too cold at the same time. A nurse at the desk pointed me down the hall when I gave my mother's name. Room 4C, third door on the left. I stopped about 15 feet away from it. Cole stopped with me. Through the small window in the door, I could see her. My mother, Vivian Ashcroft, who had never once let anyone see her without her armor on, lay in a hospital bed, hooked to machines that beeped and hummed. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her hair, always perfectly styled, was loose and gray against the pillow. Her face was bare of makeup. She wore a thin hospital gown instead of the designer clothes she considered a form of self-respect. I stood there counting the machines around her bed, 1, 2, 3, 4, as if the number might tell me something. Cole touched my shoulder gently and asked if I needed more time. I shook my head and made myself walk forward. My hand found the door handle. I pushed it open. The room smelled like hand sanitizer, and that specific hospital scent that's impossible to describe and impossible to forget. My mother's eyes were closed. Then they opened. She turned her head on the pillow, saw me standing in the doorway, and her eyes went wide, genuinely, completely shocked that I had actually come. I walked closer to the bed. Cole stayed near the door to give us room. My mother opened her mouth, and the first words out of it were an accusation dressed as a question. Where have you been for 2 years? Not hello, not thank you for coming. Just that, as though she hadn't been the one who cut me off, as though I were the one who'd vanished into thin air. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. I said I was here now, and I wanted to know how she was doing. I asked what the doctors had told her. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating whether to twist the guilt tighter or accept the small thing I was offering. For once, she chose to let it go. She said her heart was failing. She said they'd caught it just before it killed her, but it had been close. A doctor came in 10 minutes later. He was young, with tired eyes and a coffee stain on the sleeve of his white coat. He looked at me and asked if I was family. I said I was her daughter. He nodded and began explaining, in terms I could barely follow, about valve function and blood flow and surgical options. He said she'd need surgery within the next few days. He said recovery would take months. He said she wouldn't be able to live alone for a while and would need real care and support. I asked about success rates. I asked about the risks. I asked practical, precise questions while my mother watched me from the bed, searching my face for a sign. Total devotion or complete abandonment, the only 2 settings she'd ever understood. I gave her neither. I just listened to the doctor and took notes on my phone. Cole drove me home around 2 in the morning. I called my office from the car and left a message that I'd be in late. I didn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling while Cole breathed softly beside me, and I tried to understand why my chest felt so full of things I didn't have names for. The following week dissolved into a blur of hospital visits squeezed between depositions and client calls. I went Tuesday evening after a long day in court. I went Thursday on my lunch break and ate a sad sandwich in the parking structure afterward, staring at the concrete wall. My mother acted grateful and wounded in the same breath. Grateful I came, wounded that I didn't come more, as though I should abandon my entire life and set up camp beside her bed. Cole noticed that I came home tense and silent after every single visit. He found me Saturday morning sitting at our small kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. He sat down across from me and said, quietly, that he was worried. He said I seemed exhausted and anxious all the time now, that I was disappearing into something. He said I needed to figure out what level of involvement I could actually survive before it swallowed me whole. He was right, but I didn't know how to answer him. My brother called me the following Monday. I was at the firm reviewing a stack of contracts when my phone lit up with Ethan's name. We hadn't spoken in a few months, not out of any coldness, just the slow drift of two people rebuilding lives on opposite ends of the coast. I stepped out of the conference room and answered in the hallway, my back against the cool glass wall. He said he'd heard through the family grapevine that our mother was in the hospital. He asked how bad it really was, so I told him everything. The collapse, the failing heart, the surgery scheduled for Friday, the doctor with the coffee-stained coat, and his careful guarded numbers. And somewhere in the telling, the professional summary cracked open into something raw, and the two of us ended up talking for nearly 2 hours. We traded stories about Vivian, the way survivors of the same shipwreck compare scars. He reminded me of the time she'd threatened to pull his tuition over a haircut. I reminded him of the summer she'd made me quit a job I loved because the owner wasn't the right sort of people. We laughed at some of it, the dark, disbelieving laughter of people who lived through something absurd. And then we admitted the thing neither of us had said out loud before, that we both felt the exact same impossible mix of concern and resentment, love and fury, grief and relief, all tangled together in a knot too complicated to untie. Ethan confessed he felt guilty for being relieved that he lived 1,000 miles away, that the geography gave him permission to stay out of it. I confessed I felt guilty for only visiting twice a week, as though there were some correct number of hospital visits that would finally make me a good daughter. Talking to him helped more than I expected. For the first time in 2 weeks, I didn't feel completely alone inside my own confusion. Someone else in the world understood precisely what it meant to almost lose a mother you'd already had to survive. I went back to the hospital that Wednesday evening. I walked the now familiar hallway toward room 4C, my heels quiet on the polished floor, and a man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped out of the waiting area near the elevators. I recognized him instantly. Marcus Holloway, one of my mother's oldest friends, a real estate developer who'd known Vivian since before I was born, one of the men who'd sat at those long dinner party tables, nodding at her stories. He said my name and walked toward me with the kind of purpose that told me this wasn't a coincidence. He'd been waiting. He guided me, gently but firmly, into the corner near a bank of vending machines and lowered his voice into the register men like him use when they think they're being wise. He said I needed to forgive and forget because family was everything. He said my mother was sick and scared and that this was my chance, my one chance, to fix our relationship before it was too late. He said blood was thicker than water. He said I was being stubborn, that I'd inherited her worst quality and was using it against her. I kept my voice polite but immovable. I told him he didn't know the full story. I told him I was doing exactly as much as I could manage. I told him, as kindly as I could, that whatever was happening between my mother and me was between my mother and me. He looked at me with open disappointment, as though he'd expected me to dissolve into tears, and promised to become the perfect penitent daughter right there in the hallway. When I didn't, he simply stepped aside, and I walked past him into her room. Vivian was sitting up in bed, picking at a dinner tray of gray hospital food. I pulled a chair close and asked how she was feeling. She said she was tired. She said the surgery was locked in for Friday morning. Then she shifted into that careful, honeyed voice she used my entire childhood when she wanted something and needed you not to notice she was reaching for it. She said she'd been thinking. She said she'd handled things badly 2 years ago. She said she was sorry that I felt hurt by her decisions. Something cold settled in the center of my chest. The non-apology was so perfectly constructed, it almost made me laugh out loud. Sorry you felt hurt. Not sorry for what she'd done. Sorry that I'd had feelings about it. As though my reaction were the problem. As though the wound were somehow my own fault for bleeding. The little flicker of hope I'd been quietly carrying, guarded and half ashamed, deflated in my chest. She still didn't understand what she'd actually done. She couldn't hold real responsibility in her hands. It was too heavy, and she'd never learned how. I told her I appreciated her trying, and then I said nothing else because there was nothing else honest to say. The attorney called Thursday morning while I was in a meeting with a client. I saw the name Grant Delaney flash across my phone screen and stepped out to take it. He introduced himself as my mother's estate attorney. He said Vivian had asked him to contact me about updating her will, that she wanted to make changes now that she was, in his delicate phrasing, facing her mortality. Anger rose up hot and sharp behind my ribs. Even from a hospital bed, hours before surgeons cracked open her chest, she was reaching for the will, her oldest weapon, her one true language. She couldn't simply be sick. She couldn't simply let me sit beside her without turning the whole thing into a transaction, a negotiation, a contract with terms. I told Grant I had no interest in discussing her will while she was lying in a hospital bed. I said it felt obscene to talk about inheritance when she might not survive the operating table on Friday. He said, not unkindly, that he understood, but that he was simply following his client's instructions. I hung up and stood in the hallway outside the conference room, gripping the phone, trying to remember how to breathe like a normal person. Work got harder to hold on to after that. I'd sit in client meetings and realize I hadn't absorbed the last 5 minutes of conversation. I'd read the same paragraph of a contract 4 times and still not know what it said. My boss, Diane, noticed during an important pitch with a potential new client when I blanked completely on a simple question about a case timeline. She covered for me smoothly, the way good senior partners do, but she pulled me aside afterward and asked if everything was okay. I said I had some family things happening. She looked at me for a moment, then said quietly that I should let her know if I needed to take time off. And standing there in the hallway, I realized something I'd been avoiding. I could not be the daughter my mother wanted, and the lawyer my firm needed, and a whole human being all at the same time. Something was going to break, and I got to choose whether it was the work, the relationship, or me. I had to decide what I could actually give, and then accept, without apology, that it would never be enough for everyone, and that this was okay. I came home that evening drained down to the bone. Cole was in the kitchen making dinner, the whole bungalow warm and smelling of garlic and roasting vegetables. He asked how my day was, and I said fine in a voice that meant the opposite. He mentioned he'd gone to the store and picked up groceries and noticed we were almost out of coffee, and for reasons that had nothing to do with him, I snapped. I said something sharp about the grocery bags left sitting on the counter instead of being put away immediately. It was a small, ugly, unfair thing to say. Cole stopped chopping. He set the knife down on the cutting board and looked at me. The kitchen went silent except for something quietly simmering on the stove. He said I'd been on edge for days and that he was genuinely worried. I told him, flatly, that I was handling it. He shook his head slowly and said no, I wasn't handling it. I was letting it consume me. He said he watched me transform into a different person every single time I came back from that hospital. Someone tighter and colder and further away. And then he said the thing that landed like a hand pressed flat against my sternum. He said, "Your mother spent years controlling you with money. Now she's controlling you with guilt, and you're letting it happen all over again. I'm watching you lose yourself, trying to be the perfect daughter, for someone who's never once treated you like a whole person. It landed so hard because it was true. I'd been so consumed with doing the right thing, the good thing, the dutiful thing, that I'd completely forgotten to protect myself from sliding back into the exact patterns I'd nearly died escaping. I apologized for snapping at him. Really apologized, not the deflecting kind. He crossed the kitchen and pulled me into his arms and held me while I stood there stiff and then, finally, not stiff. He said we'd figure out together what I could actually give without destroying myself in the process. He didn't say I had to cut her off. He didn't say I had to forgive her. He just said we, and somehow that was the thing that let me breathe again. Ethan called 2 days later to tell me he'd booked a flight. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and Cole and I picked him up from the airport and drove straight downtown. I felt a strange, jittery nervousness about bringing him. My mother hadn't laid eyes on Ethan in over 5 years, since before she declared him dead to the family. We rode the elevator up to the cardiac floor without talking much. Ethan kept flexing his hands, a habit he'd had since childhood whenever he was bracing for impact. When we walked into room 4C together, my mother's face moved through several expressions in the space of a few seconds. Surprise first, sharp and involuntary. Then something that looked almost like fear. And then something softer underneath it. Something I didn't have a name for and had never seen on her before. She stared at the two of us standing side by side in her doorway. Her 2 rejected children, her 2 cautionary tales, standing there alive and grown and together. Ethan said hello. He asked how she was feeling. His voice was steady, kinder than she deserved. She said she was tired but recovering. And then the 3 of us sat in an awkward, weighted silence for several minutes, none of us sure who was allowed to speak first after 5 years of engineered distance. Then my mother began, very quietly, to cry. Not the theatrical, weaponized tears I'd seen my whole life, the ones she deployed to end arguments and redirect blame. These were smaller and more honest, the kind that seemed to embarrass the person crying them. She said she never thought she'd see the 2 of us in one room again. She said she'd made terrible choices and pushed away the only people who ever truly mattered. Ethan and I exchanged a look across the foot of her bed, a whole silent conversation passing between us. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't even close to accounting for what she'd done. But it was nearer to the truth than anything she'd ever said out loud, and we both felt the weight of that. We stayed about an hour and talked carefully about neutral things, the weather, the traffic on the 101, the reliably terrible hospital food. When we finally left, Ethan let out a long breath in the elevator and said that had been harder than he expected. Then, after a pause, he added, but also better, somehow. And I knew exactly what he meant. My Aunt Sandra caught me in the parking structure the next afternoon. She'd been visiting Vivian and spotted me walking toward my car. She asked if we could sit for a minute, and we found a bench outside the main entrance, under a jacaranda tree dropping purple blossoms onto the concrete. Sandra said my mother had been talking to her, in the private way sisters talk, about how lonely the past 2 years had truly been. She said Vivian missed Ethan and me far more than she would ever admit to our faces. She said my mother was simply too proud to say she'd been wrong out loud, but that she clearly felt the loss of us like a physical thing. Sandra said she'd walked in on my mother more than once, quietly looking through old photographs, crying when she thought no one was watching. Something shifted in my chest, slow and heavy. It wasn't forgiveness, I want to be honest about that. It wasn't absolution, but it was a kind of understanding I hadn't let myself feel before, that my mother was suffering too, that the walls she'd built to protect herself had ended up sealing her inside them alone. Sandra said she wasn't making excuses for anything Vivian had done. She just wanted me to know that my mother had regrets, real ones, even if she couldn't shape them into the words I needed to hear. I thanked her for telling me. She hugged me tightly and said that family was complicated, but worth fighting for when it could be saved. I didn't know yet whether ours could, but for the first time, I let myself wonder. 3 days after the surgery, my mother had a setback. I was in the room when it happened. Her heart rate dropped without warning, and the monitors began shrieking. That awful escalating alarm that turns a quiet room into a crisis in half a second. Nurses flooded in and pushed me out into the hall, and I stood at the window watching through the glass as a team of strangers worked over the small body of the woman who had ruled my entire life. I couldn't hear anything through the door. I could only watch hands moving, a doctor barking orders, a machine being wheeled into place. I called Cole. I called Ethan, who was still in town. And I waited. A doctor came out 20 minutes later, peeling off his gloves, and said she'd stabilized, but it had been close, closer than the first time. He said the next 24 hours would be critical. When they let me back in, my mother looked impossibly small, buried in tubes and wires, her chest rising and falling in shallow mechanical rhythm. I sat down in the chair beside her and, without really deciding to, took her hand. It felt thin and cold, the skin loose over the bones. Her eyes were closed, but she squeezed back, weakly but unmistakably. She knew I was there. We stayed like that for hours, into the deep part of the night. I didn't say anything, and neither did she. But something moved between us in that silence, something that didn't need language. Sitting there holding her cold hand, while the machines counted her heartbeats, I understood a thing I'd been refusing to understand. I did not want her to die, with all this anger and distance frozen solid between us. I wanted her to know that I loved her. Not the version of me she'd tried to manufacture, but me, the daughter who chose the carpenter and built her own life and came anyway when the phone rang at midnight. I wanted her to know I loved her even though she had hurt me. Both things could be true. Both things were true. And I wanted us to find some kind of peace before the clock ran all the way out. When she finally stabilized for good and woke up properly the next day, something in her seemed different, softer, sanded down at the edges. She asked me about my life with Cole, and for the first time in the history of our relationship, the question sounded genuinely curious instead of like the opening move of a cross-examination. So I told her. I told her about our bungalow in Eagle Rock, about the lemon tree in the backyard, about how Cole had built almost every piece of furniture in the house with his own hands. I described the dining table he'd made from reclaimed oak, the way the grain ran through it like a river. I told her about the bookshelves he'd designed specifically to hold my law books, measuring the spines so everything fit exactly. She listened without interrupting, without criticizing, without a single tightening around the mouth. She asked what kind of work he was doing now. I told her he'd just landed a contract building custom pieces for a new boutique hotel opening in Culver City. She was quiet for a moment, then said that sounded like good work. The whole conversation felt fragile and strange, like the two of us were carrying something made of glass across a long room, both terrified of the moment one of us would drop it. But we didn't drop it. I left the hospital that day feeling something I hadn't felt about my mother in years. Hope, maybe? Or at least the possibility of it, which, after everything, felt like nearly the same thing. The next week, I ran into my mother's nurse in the hallway. Her name was Catherine, and she'd been caring for Vivian since the day of the surgery. A calm, unhurried woman with kind eyes and the particular steadiness of someone who has watched a great many families fall apart and stitch themselves back together at the edge of a hospital bed. She stopped me near the nurse's station and said there was something she wanted me to know. She said my mother talked about me constantly. She said there was a photograph of me propped on the bedside table, an old one from before everything went wrong, and that my mother reached for it and looked at it throughout the day, sometimes for long stretches when she thought no one was paying attention. I was genuinely stunned. Vivian Ashcroft had never in my entire life displayed that kind of open, undefended affection. Sentiment, to her, had always been a weakness other people indulged in. Catherine said my mother had mentioned more than once how much she missed having me in her life, and that she seemed to carry real regret for a lot of the choices she'd made. I thanked her for telling me, and walking back down that bright, cold hallway, I found myself wondering, for the first time seriously, whether almost dying had rearranged something fundamental inside my mother, whether staring directly at the end had finally shown her that all the money and control she'd spent her life accumulating meant nothing at all, weighed against having people who actually loved you sit beside your bed. 2 weeks after the surgery, my mother asked if we could talk seriously. I pulled the chair close to her bed. She was sitting up, more alert than she'd been in weeks, the color slowly returning to her face. She said she'd done a great deal of thinking while lying there recovering, staring at the ceiling with nothing to distract her from herself. She said she'd been wrong to try to control my life the way she had. And then, this was the part that undid me. She tried to explain why. She said she'd done it because she'd wanted me to be secure. She said she grew up with nothing, that her own childhood had been marked by a kind of poverty and instability she'd never once described to Ethan or me, and that she had spent her entire adult life terrified of falling back into it. She said that when my grandfather's fortune landed in her hands, it hadn't felt like freedom. It had felt like a wall she could build between herself and that old fear. And she'd spent decades making the wall higher and thicker, dragging her children up behind it whether they wanted to come or not. She said she'd genuinely believed money could protect me from suffering, that if she just controlled enough of the variables, she could keep pain away from me forever. I told her as gently as I could that real security doesn't come from money or from someone else's control. I said it comes from being loved for exactly who you are, not for what you do or who you marry or which zip code you live in. I told her that feeling controlled and conditional. My whole life hadn't felt like security at all. It had felt like a cage with a very nice view. And my mother started to cry. Real tears, the honest kind, the second time I'd ever witnessed it. She said she understood that now, but she wished with everything in her that she'd understood it sooner. She said she'd wasted so many years being afraid, trying to control things that never needed controlling, holding tight to a weapon she'd mistaken for love. I reached over and held her hand while she cried, and I didn't say anything, because for once there was nothing that needed fixing or negotiating or defending. There was just my mother, finally undefended, and me, holding on. A few days later, she said she wanted to meet Cole properly, not glimpse him lingering by the door, actually talk to him, get to know the man I'd chosen. I felt nervous about it, old alarm bells ringing out of pure habit, but I agreed. I brought him to the hospital that weekend. My mother was sitting up, looking more like herself than she had in a month. She reached out and shook Cole's hand and thanked him, sincerely, for coming. And then she began to ask him questions about his work, his family, how the two of us had met. Cole answered everything honestly and patiently, with that easy calm of his that no amount of Ashcroft interrogation could rattle. He told her about learning carpentry from his grandfather in a garage in Boyle Heights, about the first chair he'd ever built and how badly it had wobbled, about why working with wood made him feel connected to something older than himself. He told her about the coffee shop in Silver Lake, about complimenting my book, about knowing within the first hour that he wanted to know me for the rest of his life. My mother asked pointed questions about his business, his income, his plans for the future, the old instincts still firing, but Cole never got defensive and never once tried to impress her. He simply told the truth, that he loved his work, that he loved me, that we were building a good and honest life together. I watched my mother's face the entire time, and I saw her actually listening to him. Maybe for the first time listening to anyone without simultaneously calculating how to control them. After Cole stepped out to get coffee, my mother was quiet for a while. Then she said softly that she could see why I'd chosen him. She said he clearly loved me and treated me well. She said he seemed like a good man who made me happy. It wasn't an apology for the years of threats and control. It wasn't close to making up for any of it. But it was her acknowledging, out loud, that my choice had been valid, that I had known what was right for my own life all along. And after a lifetime of having every decision second-guessed and overruled, that meant far more than I ever expected it to. Grant, the estate attorney, called me the following week. He said my mother had given him new instructions regarding her will. She wanted to restore me as a beneficiary. I drove to the hospital and asked her about it directly, because I was done letting the will be a thing that happened to me in the background. She said she wanted to do right by me while she still could. I told her, plainly, that I didn't want her money if it came attached to conditions or expectations, that I'd built an entire life without a dollar of it, and I was more than fine. She looked at me for a long moment and said there were no conditions this time. She said she simply wanted to know that I'd be taken care of if something ever happened to her. She said it wasn't about control anymore. It was about love. I didn't know if I fully believed her. Old habits of self-protection don't dissolve overnight. But I could see clearly that she was trying. And trying from a woman who had never once had to was its own kind of miracle. I coordinated with Ethan to take our mother to her follow-up appointment the next week. We met at the hospital entrance and walked together into the cardiology wing. Vivian sat between us in the waiting room and reached out and took both our hands at the same time, mine and Ethan's. Her fingers were still thin and cool, but her grip was firm now, alive. She looked at me first, then at Ethan, and her eyes filled. She said she'd been thinking, all through her recovery, about the years she'd wasted trying to control us instead of simply loving us. She said she could have spent all that time actually enjoying having her children in her life. But she'd been too busy being proud and stubborn and afraid. She said she finally understood what she'd thrown away when she cut us off, and that she was sorry it had taken nearly dying for her to figure it out. Ethan squeezed her hand. My throat closed so tight, I couldn't have spoken if I'd wanted to. And then the nurse called her name, and the three of us stood up together, still holding on. When the appointment came back showing good progress, I heard myself suggest something I never imagined I'd say: a family dinner, at our house. My mother looked genuinely surprised, and then she said yes immediately, before she could talk herself out of it. Cole and I spent the whole weekend getting ready. He cleaned every corner of the bungalow while I cooked, and both of us were quietly so nervous about having Vivian Ashcroft inside our small, unpretentious home for the first time. Ethan arrived first, straight from the airport, carrying a bottle of wine. Then Aunt Sandra showed up with an armful of flowers. And finally my mother arrived, carrying a store-bought dessert she'd clearly agonized over choosing. A small human gesture from a woman who'd spent her life having caterers handle such things. I watched her walk through our living room, taking everything in. She stopped at the dining table, the one Cole had built from reclaimed oak, and ran her hand slowly across the smooth surface of the wood. She asked him how long it had taken to make. He explained the whole process, selecting the boards, letting them acclimate, joining the pieces so the grain flowed unbroken from one end to the other. She listened to every word, and then she said it was beautiful work, that she could tell he'd put real care into it. Cole looked pleased and just slightly stunned. We sat down to eat, and the conversation stayed light at first, Sandra telling old stories about eccentric relatives, Ethan talking about his shop in Portland. My mother asked Cole about his hotel contract and actually seemed interested in the answers. She complimented the food. She thanked me for hosting. And at one point, I looked around my own dining table and realized, with a quiet ache, that this was precisely the kind of family gathering I'd wanted my entire life and never once believed we could have. Everyone relaxed, everyone genuine, nobody performing for anybody else, nobody keeping score. After dinner, we moved to the living room and talked for another hour before people began drifting home. At the door, my mother hugged me and thanked me again for including her. She held on a second longer than she needed to. 3 months passed, and my mother continued to recover well. We settled into a rhythm neither of us had ever had, a phone call every week, dinner once a month. And then came the real test. She asked me to attend a charity gala with her on a night I already had plans with Cole. I braced myself, my whole body remembering the old shape of these moments, the guilt, the pressure, the implied threat humming underneath. I explained that I couldn't make it, and I waited for the pushback. Instead, she just said, "Okay." And then she asked if we could do lunch the following week instead. That was the moment it became real for me. That small, unremarkable okay proved she was actually capable of respecting a boundary when she chose to. That the woman who had once threatened to erase me from existence over a dinner date could now hear the word no and simply accept it. Our relationship wasn't perfect, and I doubt it ever will be. She still let slip the occasional comment that revealed her old way of thinking, a raised eyebrow at a decision, well, if it were me, that trailed off. But when I named it, gently, she apologized and tried to do better every time. She asked about Cole's work and remembered the details from one conversation to the next. She reached out to Ethan on her own, without being prompted, and put in the slow, steady labor of rebuilding that relationship too. The change wasn't dramatic or complete or cinematic. It was quieter than that and better than that. It was consistent. And for the first time, I let myself believe this new version of us might actually hold. One evening, Cole and I sat in our living room scrolling through photos on my phone from that first family dinner. He pointed at one of my mother caught mid-laugh at something Ethan had said, her head thrown back entirely unguarded, and he remarked how completely different she looked from the stern, calculating woman I'd described from the hospital months before. I scrolled through more of them, and somewhere in the middle of that small, ordinary act, I understood something that reorganized how I'd seen my entire life. For years, I had believed there were only two possible endings with my mother: submit completely or cut her off entirely. Obey the queen or become another cautionary tale. Those were the only two doors I could see, and both of them cost me myself. But I'd stumbled into a third door I never knew existed. I got my family back, but on terms that were honest and healthy instead of manipulative and conditional. I hadn't surrendered, and I hadn't disappeared. I'd stood in the middle, on my own ground, and let her come to me. Vivian Ashcroft would never be the warm, unconditionally loving mother I'd ached for as a child. She would always carry that controlling streak, that reflexive need to manage and arrange and protect. But she was trying now in ways she never had before, and that effort, imperfect and incomplete, meant something real. I'd learned that sometimes good enough genuinely is enough, that an imperfect relationship can still hold enormous value as long as both people are actually willing to work at it, that love and money were never the same thing, and that once I finally refused to trade one for the other, I somehow ended up with both, in the only forms that were ever worth having. Cole slid his arm around my shoulders and asked what I was thinking about. I looked at the lemon tree through the window, going gold in the last of the light, and at the oak table he'd built with his own hands, and at the small, honest life we'd made out of nothing but our own choices. I told him I was just grateful for how things had turned out, and I meant it.